Okay, thank you. Welcome. Just to start, this is the In Memoriam. This is a new student-run initiative. It's an interview series where we try to explore the depth of university research. So we explore a number of different schools. And today I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Arri Eisen. He will be our first panel. This will be part of our first panel discussion of the series. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Would you maybe like to start by telling us a bit about your background, your history, and how you got to the university?
Sure. Well, I grew up in North Carolina in the 70s and 80s and went to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, which was a fun place to go to school in those days, probably still is. Was always interested in biology. My father is a geneticist, but also at Chapel Hill, it's a very liberal arts atmosphere, so I always enjoyed taking classes on the other side of campus, so to speak, in poetry writing or philosophy or whatever it was. So felt like I got a pretty good undergraduate education. I was initially interested in medical school, but then wised up and decided still studied science. When I was an undergrad, I studied genetics of some basic questions about how genes are regulated in fruit flies, of all things. Mm-hmm. So that comes back later in the story. And then I went to graduate school and got a PhD in biochemistry at the University of Washington in Seattle, which is a wonderful place to do that kind of thing. It's very relaxed. There was 2 or 3 Nobel laureates in the building. It's a beautiful place, mountains, water, kind of inspiring place to do science. And now it's even more so. Biotech has grown up there from a lot of that generation. But discovered early on in my PhD that research wasn't going to be so much my thing in the classical test tube kind of way. Mm-hmm. I was good at it as judged by publications and all that, but it didn't get my soul mm-hmm. in the way that teaching did, which is ironic because both my parents were teachers, and I guess usually you ignore your parents. But it turned out I was a teacher too. So to get my PhD, we were required to do a lot of teaching for our fellowship. So that was a gift to me, and kind of discovered my passion there. And I'd kept in touch with my fruit fly boss from back in undergrad days, and told him as I was evolving as a person, as a scientist, that I was not going to be a researcher, but probably focus more on teaching. Mm-hmm. So it just so happened that he came to Emory to be the chair of the biology department, and right when I was finishing my PhD, and basically just called me in the lab one day, this is John Lucchese, and said, "Do you have a job yet?" So I came to Emory and just kind of been here. This is my 34th year, and it's been a wonderful place. Emory was just taking off then with the big gifts from Woodruff and Candler, mm-hmm. and for better or worse, once you get a lot of money, you get more money, and once you get more money, you get more money, and attracting. So I got to be here as Emory's kind of grown up, and of course that helped me a lot because the more resources, the better students you have, mm-hmm. the more cool stuff you can do. So I was able to get involved in designing and teaching new courses in biology, and then realized to be a really good science teacher, or at least to really understand science, mm-hmm. you got to have a better understanding of history and philosophy and ethics, and got involved in starting a new program in Science and Society, got involved in the Center for Ethics, which is a university-wide program, started meeting all kinds of different interesting, brilliant people all over Emory, was co-teaching with, and just to give you an example of all the fun that I've had, was co-teaching with a guy who had been a Buddhist monk, and then came to get his PhD at Emory, and then got married, so he's no longer a monk, but still maintained his connections with the Dalai Lama. So, and that's how I got into this whole 20-year project of working with the Dalai Lama and bringing science to his monks and nuns, among many other exciting things. So that's kind of me in a nutshell. Along the way, I had 3 boys, mm-hmm. two of whom came through Emory, and it's been fun so far.
And have they followed suit and pursued biology or biochemistry?
Oh, no. One of them, the two that came to Emory, he did his honors thesis on the history of anarchy in Atlanta, and he's more of a social activist kind of guy. The other one that came to Emory does want to probably be a physician, so he's thinking about medical school. And then our third son would probably be a businessman. He's still in college, so you never know.
And Emory caters to all three, of course.
Yeah.
Fantastic. And so I'm curious, at what stage did you was that point in time in which you decided that research was not for you? So was this more your undergrad experience? Was this influenced by
No. It wasn't until in graduate school, as you know, you've really got to immerse yourself in the research, and that's when it became clear that it just took all my psychic energy, which is okay for some people, and I think for the best researchers that's also true, but it was not something that I got nearly as much reward from as I did with working with students.
Yes.
And you know, different people. We need good researchers, and I just wasn't going to be one of them. Now it turned out that through this pathway I described to you earlier, that I'm still able to do research. It's just not your traditional bench research. Although when I came to Emory, for the first 10 years or so I was here, I still did research in epigenetics and biochemistry on the side, so to speak, in that gentleman's lab who had brought me here. But for the most part, research I do now has to do with education, ethics, cross-cultural learning, things like that.
I see, yes. And of course you've been involved in starting a number of initiatives, and you're involved in FIRST as well. Maybe.
Yeah. So probably about a quarter century ago, a gentleman, Cliff Poudry, Native American fruit fly biologist, kind of stumbled across this idea at the National Institutes of Health, the major funder of research in the world, but definitely in the United States, trying to bring underrepresented groups more effectively into the sciences, whether it was education, research, what have you. Still a problem, but Cliff had this vision of partnering. It was kind of a radical idea at the time, sadly, but partnering Research One institutions with historically minority schools through research as a focus, because he was at the NIH after all. So through another serendipitous turn of events at Emory, I got involved in one of the first versions of these programs. They're called Institutional Research and Career Development Awards, IRACTA, government acronyms, through the Institute of General Medicine at Medical Sciences at the NIH. And what these are, so we have a partnership between Emory as the big research school, and then Morehouse, Clark Atlanta, Spelman, and Morehouse School of Medicine, where folks who already have PhDs in the sciences. So one thing we did do better at for a while, although we didn't start with much, was getting underrepresented people PhDs in the sciences.
Yes.
But then what happened to them is they would leave science for all different kinds of interesting reasons we can get into. Economic, social, all the expected ones, racism, etc. So Cliff was like, well, maybe we can keep these folks in science if we create programs that are like FIRST. So FIRST is fellowships in research and science teaching, and we bring in nowadays 4 to 7 postdocs a year for 4 years, and they do their research at Emory usually, and then I teach them a course on how to teach, and then they get a mentor, and they get to teach their own course eventually at Spelman, Clark Atlanta, or Morehouse. Yes. So we've done that for 23 years, and then the question is, does that keep them in science? And the answer is yes. So we now have 200 plus alumni out there, and whereas before a very low number of, as I mentioned, underrepresented PhDs stayed in science, compared to our group where virtually all of them, over 95%, have stayed in science after coming through this experience where they get a kind of social, intellectual cohort, which it turns out benefits everyone, of course, but especially underrepresented people for obvious reasons. So that was one of the wonderful things I was able to get involved with, and that's still ongoing. Probably the coolest manifestation of those is every year we have the meetings where the new fellows are coming in to meet potential teaching mentors at the AUC schools. AUC is Atlanta University Center.
Yes.
And you see generations of the first program now. So probably 20 or 30 of former first fellows are faculty at those schools now.
Yes.
So now they're mentoring our current fellows, and then their mentors from the previous generation are all in the room at the same time.
Yes.
So it's quite powerful.
And creates a sense of artificial intergenerationality as well.
Yeah, it's very cool.
And do the majority of them remain go into academia within the science community, or do they leave academia? Do they take on teaching roles?
Yeah, that's a good question. So what we did once in 2017 was the last time we did it. 2018 was kind of an analysis of did they stay in science? If they did, what are they doing? And we didn't have a really good comparison group, but the best we could come up with was the traditional NIH postdocs at Emory, I think. And as you might expect, more of the traditional postdocs went to academic institutions as opposed to, say, liberal arts colleges or small teaching institutions. Because, of course, we're going to attract probably more of those.
Yes.
But, like I said, first of all, the fact that they stayed in science at all is important. And then the percentages they were more likely to go to teaching or liberal arts colleges, although a bunch are still doing research, and the amounts that went into biotech were about the same. So overall, the profile wasn't that different. So if you got into what kinds of academia they went into.
Yeah.
And then we looked at the people that did go into more traditional science academia, how successful were they compared to traditional postdocs. And they were as successful in terms of publication, getting grants, all those kind of measures as our postdocs, first postdocs, were as or more successful.
Yes.
In those areas. So it seems like it's the data say it works.
Excellent. And I imagine part of the effort is also to try to not just achieve academic success, but also more effective integration, being able to use that knowledge in order to either both teach classes but more effectively, or also to interact with colleagues in a more effective light. Do you think, but at a personal level as well, do you believe that they felt better able to integrate into the communities?
Yes. I mean, one thing is it's just kind of the communities evolve separately. The NIH has one set of goals traditionally is to get a good community of scientists who can cure diseases and solve problems and raise grants and things. And then there's the educational community, which is related, but in some ways is not. So you would think, if you've ever taken a science course before in a college, you know that the two don't cross that much. Often your science professors, through no fault of their own, are not what you would call great educators, unless that happens accidentally. So yeah, like I said, when you do programs like this that work, they help everyone, right? So we don't just cater. Anybody can do these Eractive programs. Majority students, all different kinds of people, and it benefits them all, and it tends to benefit those around them. But nowadays, people just come to our website to hire people. They don't even have to apply for jobs because they know, like you're implying, Caïus, they know that these people aren't just good researchers, but they're also already good teachers. They know how to teach, so they can hit the ground running, because it's so difficult, probably in any field, but the field I can speak to is to get tenure or to be successful in the sciences is not easy. If you can come already prepared to hit the ground in terms of hit the ground running in terms of research and teaching, and you've already thought and practiced doing both at once, it makes it a lot easier. Yes. So yes, the answer is
yes. So I think by virtue, as what you've mentioned, it is quite difficult to have both an academic as well as a teaching background, and both at a personal level, in my own biology courses as well, there is a tendency often to have the very high state-of-the-art research, but without the means to effectively deliver that, particularly as a field like biology is evolving so rapidly compared to often other sciences as well, being able to communicate that effectively is so pivotal. So,
yeah, the third big thing I've done at Emory is related to that. I'll just mention it briefly, and that's the creation to address this very thing. Like, how do you, from the student's perspective, an undergraduate's perspective, how do they get those benefits when it's often not the same person that's the ideal researcher and the ideal teacher? So one thing I helped to do at Emory is develop a teaching track about in the mid-90s, sometimes say 93, 94, that addresses that very thing. So what it does is it allows people like me who have the terminal degree in the field, so they know how to do science, but they want to teach and they want to focus on teaching and cutting edge teaching research, and complement that with, you know, the Nobel laureate types, right, or future Nobel laureates. So one way we've addressed your concerns, there's at least two ways to go about. One is have specific programs where you're trained in teaching and research before you become a professor. And another complementary approach is to have a track where you're evaluated based on scholarship and teaching. And then those complement each other. So for example, in our biology department at Emory, there's 40 faculty. There's probably 10 of those that are on this teaching track. And we go to the teaching meetings and bring that knowledge back and help and co-teach with the tenure track professors. The tenure track professors go to the science knowledge meetings and bring that back. And what the student gets out of it is a good deal, right? They can get courses from both. They can do research with both. So that's those two models of how do you, from the student's perspective, how do you get the most out of a college education where you both get the research experience and the researchers like maybe you and the teaching one, I think are both effective. Yes. And we're lucky enough to be able to do them both here.
Absolutely. Not least as I think there's growing emphasis as well in undergrads to become involved in a lot of research as well. So being able to complement the research on the same time as the theory, and being able to select between sort of tenure track professors and
and a lot of exactly. And a lot of the undergrads also get the experience of teaching, of really teaching. So again, going back one step in the pipeline, so to speak. For whatever reason, teaching, like I pointed out in myself earlier, is now kind of one of the things the smart people in the United States aspire to, and the students that come here. You're aspiring to be a lawyer, a doctor, businessman, pretty much. If you're a smart one in this country, that's what you're supposed to do. So, of course, if you're going to become any of those, being a good teacher, or anything else for that matter, being a good teacher is useful. But there's also a lot of people that are like me, that if you give them a chance to do some teaching, when they're early on trying to figure things out, there's a good chance that they're good at it, they'll see how cool it is, and they might become a teacher or integrate teaching more intentionally into whatever they do. So in a lot of my classes, so for example, this semester I'm teaching, I think, 4 classes, and every one of them, there's a total of maybe 15 TAs. All of them are undergrads or grad students getting a chance to actually teach in an environment where it's not PowerPoints and you're not reading slides, but you're actually teaching. So that's really cool to see. So most of the undergrads have taken the course with me, so they know how it works, and now they're able to take on that other role. Some of them are even involved in research and teaching to complement the research in the lab. So all of these different things are, I think, complementary and helping the next level, so to speak.
Yes. And I guess it goes back to a dual feedback approach in which, by teaching, I guess this is what Richard Feynman always described to, by teaching you are learning the material yourself.
You're learning the material, and you're learning like the value of communicating that material, not just because it's material, but like how to do it. You know, how do people most effectively learn, and why, right? So those are, like I say, valuable skills, whether you're a businessman or a doctor or lawyer, whatever.
Yes. So moving slightly on to the next major project that you've been involved in, quite an extraordinary project, the Emory-Tibet Science Initiative. But could you maybe start by describing what this is broadly, and then we can go into some of the details.
Yeah. So ETSI, Emory-Tibet Science Initiative, was kind of dreamed up in 2 ways. One was the vision. So His Holiness the Dalai Lama had this, is from a tradition I learned later called Nalanda, the Nalanda tradition of Buddhism. There's many different versions of Buddhism, as many as there are versions of Christianity or more, of course, because it's over half the world or more.
Geographic span.
But the Tibetan Buddhists are the only ones that still practice this Nalanda tradition. And I'm not an expert in it by any means, but one of the fundamental views, enlightening views, I think, of that branch of Buddhism is that in order to understand your own life, your own worldview, you have to understand everybody else's.
Yes.
So this is a very non-Judeo-Christian way to look at things. And it was one of the first things that, at least unconsciously, hit me in working with with these folks. Anyway, to go back to your question, clearly the Dalai Lama saw that one of the big things that every ways of looking at the world out there in the 21st century is science. And that, so therefore he wanted his monks and nuns, and very emphasis on the nuns, to learn science and become aware of it. And he had, we could talk about this more, but he had, of course, pushback within his community, because it turns out that being the Dalai Lama is not something where you dictate what's going to happen and it happens. He just has ideas, and then it's people down, the abbots and things that have more of the power. Anyway, he invited Emory to think about how we could bring modern science into his monasteries and nunneries. So just a quick backup. Of course, Tibet is viewed as a separate country by Tibetans, but it's viewed as part of China by China. And they've had various degrees they've had long and contentious, positive, negative historical relationship going back centuries and centuries.
Yes.
The most recent version of which is that after Mao, or in the late 50s, so Mao was still there, the Chinese kind of really clamped down on Tibet. The Dalai Lama and a bunch of people went into exile and were accepted into India and given refugee camps in the south, which they still occupy, and then Dalai Lama and a kind of exile government in the north, in Dharamsala. So that's just so they've reestablished, even though the monasteries and nunneries still exist in their original versions in Tibet, they're kind of under Chinese repression, Chinese government repression. And a second version of them is reestablished in India, of a lot of these things, so just as background. So, of course, the Dalai Lama was talking about Emory going to India.
Yes.
And this was his grand vision. And he had a couple of specifics in mind. He'd already been having a lot of conversations that people can read about in all kinds of interesting books about the overlap between consciousness and this long history of meditation and understandings of the mind in Tibetan Buddhism. Number one. Number two, in quantum physics, which he had a lot of conversations with David Bohm and other famous physicists about that overlaps in that area, because in both those areas there seems to be a lot of synergy or complementarity. And if you read the Dalai Lama story, he'd always been interested in kind of how things work anyway. So all that said, he's like, all right, Emory, see if you can come up with a way to bring this science to us in a meaningful way. So like I said earlier in our conversation, I happened to be working with this former Buddhist monk from Tibet at the time, and he kind of pulled me into this. So that was the grand vision, and then there was the napkin vision, where one of these monks, the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives in Dharamsala is our partner, our Tibetan partner in this project with Emory. And Geshe Lakdor, the head of that library still, this is in early 2000s, came to Emory, and my friend Lobsang, the former monk, and the three of us got together in my office, like literally over a napkin, and just kind of talked about what we could do. And then we spent 2 years figuring out, like, how do you teach, 30, 40, 50-year-old people who are very smart but have no idea about.
No formal science training.
No formal science training. It turned out, to say the least, like a lot of them had never seen an equal sign before or done any math, or a lot of the assumptions we have, plus others we didn't realize until later. How do we teach them science, and to what level? And we spent a long time inviting people in who'd had some experience doing it, other projects, scientists who'd gone over there to talk to the monks about their Nobel-winning science, which of course the monks had no understanding of.
Yes.
But they appeared to be very appreciative. Americans who'd become Tibetan Buddhist monks in Tibet, so they really understood the culture. We talked to everybody we could, and then we gave it like a 6-year pilot in Dharamsala where we invited monks up and tried out different things and realized how little we knew. And then after 6 years of teaching neuroscience, life sciences, and physics, which eventually became math to start with because we realized they didn't know any math. Then we brought it down south to the monasteries after we had a kind of idea of what we were doing. And now we ran through a whole 6-year curriculum as a pilot and as a actual thing. And now we've handed it over to monks and nuns, some of whom have come to Emory for 2 years for training, others whom we trained there. And now it's 90% in the hands of the Tibetan monastics and lay Tibetan scientists that are doing all the teaching and continuing what we started in Tibetan. We were always teaching with translation, of course. So that's kind of the short version of the long story, 18 years worth.
Fantastic. So how long did it take before the training could effectively become institutionalized and you didn't have to deliver the teaching materials?
12 years-ish. So there was a group of monks that were in those very first classes in Dharamsala. Several of them came to Emory for 2 years, or 3 years, 2.5. And they went back and there's 3 big monastic universities that we work out of, and now it's kind of filtered out into other monasteries in India as well. So that generation is now 18 years older. So a lot of them are the heads of their monasteries or in positions of relative power, as well as being the first science generation. So a lot of them are doing teaching. So I'd say, even though the Dalai Lama called it a 100-year project, I would say it only took 10 to 15 years before we think it's reached a kind of sustainable point, even without us going back there. We go back there twice a year, a small group of us. So by the end of the part where we were teaching it, we were sending like over 200 faculty to India every summer. That was, non-sustainable, we knew.
Yes.
Because, it's 3 topics, 3 universities, 6 levels going on simultaneously, et cetera. But now we just send a few faculty over there developing research projects. So the monks and nuns are actually doing research that they start themselves, and developing their teaching skills. So as you and I were talking about earlier, of course, a big difference between knowing stuff and being able to teach it. Especially when in their tradition they have very different pedagogical ways than we think are the best ways to teach science, because they teach Buddhist philosophy or learn Buddhist philosophy. So we're trying to get them to think about different ways of teaching. So now we have explicit training in teaching and doing research projects, but that's like scaled way back to like maybe a dozen faculty a year.
So you've already touched on one of the difficulties in crossing both the sort of cultural and geographic divide in terms of maths literacy, or even just the scientific method, understanding that. Although I have the impression that perhaps the Buddhist school of thought could be thought of in a manner of sort of hypothesis testing in terms of understanding how others perceive the world. But were there any other challenges associated with making that a cultural divide?
Yeah, there's a lot of challenges. They have a rich mythology, which came up a lot earlier in our initial teaching, which isn't consistent with science. I don't know if it's wrong or it's just mythology, so it doesn't really fit. So some of those ideas are interesting and can be ways into thinking about at least how science works in different ways than mythology do, in terms of and I can give you some examples in a minute, but let me answer your question. It turns out that they don't write. And who would have thought, that was one of the assumptions. We knew they didn't know much math. We didn't know how little math they knew, but we never even thought that they wouldn't be writers.
They don't write in Sanskrit?
they know, some of them know how to write and can read and stuff, but when they learn, it's all about listening, then maybe taking notes, memorizing the text, the scripture, and then orally debating it, one-on-one or in groups. So they don't use writing like we do as a synthesis or as a reflection or or at least this is the way we used to use writing. I don't know. It's becoming less of a thing. So that was kind of one of those things that it's so basic to the way we do things that, we would ask them to do things in writing, then it became evident that it just wasn't something they could do. There's a lot of kind of deeper philosophical divides or differences that there's no way you could realize until you just are one day, until what always happens. It's like one day you're teaching something and it suddenly hits you that it's not making any sense within their worldview. So for example, I was trying to explain the difference between correlation and cause and effect, which, based on what you and I do, is central, if not fundamental, etc. Well, I realize as I'm trying to make up analogies and do all the usual stuff you do when you're trying to explain a complicated new concept, I realize that if you live in a world where everything is causally linked, there's no difference. And then
causation is correlation.
Yeah, and vice versa. So you're like, what do we do with this? And so there are moments like that, inevitably, and they're really hard to know what they're going to be until they happen. They also happen in reverse. So I'll give you an example. Like, I was talking to Kunchuk, a monk who became a good friend, and one of the weirdest, most far out Buddhist ideas that doesn't fit science is, of course, reincarnation.
Yes.
Which is linked to karma and in different ways. So it's not something, everybody kind of avoided it because what's the point, right? Well, one day, so Kunchak was taking a class with that same professor I was telling you about that hired me here on epigenetics. And one day we were talking about, he and I were having coffee and we were talking about epigenetics, and we realized that epigenetics is kind of like karma. Transgenerational epigenetics is kind of like karma. So for those of you who don't know, there's this idea, relatively new and still a little controversial, although I'm entirely convinced that some of the things that we experience, we don't know exactly which things and why, can be, or the sensitivity to them, I should say, can be passed on to the next generation along with your genes.
Yes.
Still kind of controversial. But anyway, Kunchak had been learning about this. In other words, that you're not just passing on your DNA history, you and your spouse, to your child, but also some of your personal chemical history riding on the back of that DNA. So that's very analogous to karma, because karma says that you are the sum of your experiences, and whether or not in what form you're reincarnated as another sentient being has to do with your karma, and your karma comes from your actions and what you do, which is your experiences.
Yeah.
So we just thought that was kind of interesting, and the Dalai Lama points out again and again, he didn't want us to do this so that we could all hold hands and see how similar, Buddhism and science is. No, he just wants the monks and nuns to learn science. But, of course, as you do that, inevitably these interesting differences and parallels and similarities arise, and as educators, they're great entrees into very complicated topics. We can say, this is very similar and yet very different to something you've already, this is like part of who you are. So let's talk about that, and it helps people understand things. So, in answer to your original question, which was things that you run up against that make it difficult, some of those things are also valuable entrees into demonstrating either how that knowledge is especially different and why, or if you think that's true, Mr. Monk or Mrs. Nun, how would you show it scientifically? Is this a scientific concept? And if it is, how could we test it?
Yes.
So then you get a really good opportunity to show that. I'll give you one quick experience, which is kind of funny. So I was teaching with a friend of mine over there in Dharamsala. So you have like, was it in Dharamsala? No, it was down south in one of the monasteries. And you had like 50 to 100 monks and nuns sitting on the floor in front of you with the robes, and
Yes.
they're all bald, and it's 100 degrees out, and you're kind of going on and asking questions. And we were teaching them about evolution, and they got it really fast. They got Darwin's basic concepts of natural selection and survival of the fittest and cooperation, all this stuff really fast. So we decided, well, rather than going too thick on that, why don't we get them to go out there and do some projects, get them invested. And they had just learning how to use the internet at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And we had just brought the internet into the monasteries and nunneries. So that has all of its own issues, as you can imagine. And one of the groups, and we were helping them come up with ideas, and then they would go and like study these things and see if they could come up with
Mm-hmm.
evidence. One of the groups was exploring this idea. I think they had to take a Buddhist idea and an evolution idea and see if they were similar or different. I think that was the original. Anyway, these guys, apparently there's a Buddhist mythology that humans didn't evolve from smaller stuff,
Mm-hmm.
but from giants.
And then descended from giants effectively in size.
Yeah, and it turns out if you look into it, there's other cultures around the world that think this kind of stuff.
Yes.
Maybe it kind of makes some sense in different ways you could think about. Anyway, the point is that for this question is that they went online and they found evidence that this was true. Because, of course, we didn't know this, but there was this fundamentalist Christian group that had photoshopped these pictures of giant human fossils, like the size of this 30 feet long, with a picture of a real person lying next to this fossil. And they were so excited because they'd found evidence, and it was online, on the computer,
Had to be
that we must have evolved from giants. So that was a classic case of saying, all right, well, how does science work? How would we know whether this was true or not? And it got us into replicability and peer review and all kinds of things we hadn't really thought about. But the internet itself, if anybody can just put stuff out there, what is the internet? What are its limitations? How do we know if it's true? And it got us into these huge philosophical, interesting conversations that we never would have predicted. So that's one example.
Yes. I guess in a sense that sort of reflects how the sources are typically used. That if you have sort of fundamental liturgical texts like the Dhammapada or like the Pali Canon, then you effectively rely on those as definitive. You don't search for verification or evidence that they're actually reputable sources.
Yeah.
Whereas the internet is very obviously.
Yeah, that's a good point. So it wound up teaching a lot of lessons, which were probably valuable, much more valuable for them than any of the science that we said, right? Because they were just starting to get phones, and there was a big controversy whether they should allow monks and nuns to have phones, which is more basic than it sounds, because for a lot of them, that was the first time they could communicate so with their families back in Tibet.
Yeah.
So that's a wonderful thing. But, they all want to play games, of course, and watch the World Cup and do all the other things we do. So it was kind of an interesting moment in the middle of an evolution class. Who would have thought? So.
Yes. And I can imagine perhaps in the discussion of epigenetics, a discussion of Lamarckian evolution might have emerged as part of that discussion. In a way, it's easier to understand the principle of Lamarckian evolution, and perhaps if you support a reincarnation viewpoint.
Yeah, exactly. And it's fun to do that. It's fun to have students it's fun to work with totally clueless students, right, so to speak, because you can have them not be biased by the typical things that our students are, and just say, okay, guys, come up with ways this could have happened. And then, there's Lamarck. They come up with all the different possibilities and ones you haven't thought of, and then you can kind of, again, work through them. As scientists, how do we address these things?
Yes. And you can build on that and look at the true history, for example, of how the modern synthesis came into existence, and you can compare their own accounts, but I guess you're using their own creativity, their thought process as to how evolution might be working to drive that.
Yeah, and where the limits are and what we still don't know and what we how we might find those things out,
Yes.
and like that. Yep.
So if you were to describe the course, so you mentioned it's a 6-year course, it's incorporating biology, neuroscience, maths. How's the course structured? By the end of the course,
so it's actually three.
Yeah.
So the way we did it, and I don't know how they're doing it now logistically in the monasteries that we're not there, but in the summers, they would have 6 hours a day, all day for a week, neuroscience, and then life science, and then physics. And the first year and the last year, a little bit of philosophy of science. So the courses, of course, overlapped in some areas, but we were limited in a lot of ways, just logistically in terms of getting people there. So they're actually separate, and we wrote texts and translated texts for all those years. Sometimes we used other people's texts and just translated them, texts that had already been written for others. So let's see, did I answer that again?
Yes, I think that answers it. And presumably there's a terminal qualification attached to that.
Sorry?
And there's a terminal qualification. Is the goal to effectively integrate that into existing Buddhist teachings, or simply as a provisional course?
Yeah, that's a good question. So now what's happened is, if you are thinking about becoming like a PhD monk, which they call, or nun, which they call a geshe or geshe la degree, if you're even thinking about that, you have to take 6 years you have to do the science curriculum. And at the end of that, you get a certificate in science. And then, so that's, and I suppose if you don't continue, you still have that experience.
Fantastic. And I'm intrigued. So of course, you've mentioned cases where obviously there are points of conflict between ideology or what is described in terms of the Buddhist canon, the Buddhist mythology and science principles. I'm curious in terms of students, how do they integrate, of the students you've interacted with, for example, like Tom Zhang and others, how do they integrate their existing Buddhist belief with their scientific teaching?
Oh yeah, so I wanted to say this earlier. I'm glad you reminded me. So you asked, is this a separate course or is this somehow integrated? And I guess inevitably, but definitely good from our perspective, we hear a lot of anecdotes about how the science they learn comes into the Buddhist and philosophy classrooms in the same way that we saw the Buddhism come into our classrooms. And that, which is exactly the point of the Nalanda tradition, right, is to bring in other perspectives to enrich your own, to make you a better scientist or a better Buddhist, depending on your perspective. So we certainly have a lot of anecdotes about that happening, especially there's things like, apparently in Buddhist philosophy, color, and a lot of philosophy, colors, and the discussion of colors and vision is very prominent. So they've learned that biophysics, they've learned a lot of stuff about colors, so it comes in there, but evolution comes in a lot. So we do hear a lot about that kind of cross-pollination, which is wonderful. And you asked me about things where there's similarities between the two. Yeah, I think it happens more often than differences. So you mentioned just the way we go about things. Nalanda Buddhism is very much about, as the Dalai Lama said, you show me something, it's true, and I'll change my beliefs.
Yes.
He literally said that. Can you imagine like a religious leader in the West saying that? So they're very kind of experience-driven, and it's not quite the same thing as an experiment. It's being experiment-driven, but it's
more sort of personal sensory experience, I imagine.
Yeah, it's more personal, but there is overlap in there because obviously a person has to do the experiment over and over again. So if you have the experience over and over again, so in terms of in conversations where I'm talking about this stuff in the science and religion world, this is kind of cheating, right? Because already Nalanda Buddhism they invited us in, and partly because they're very open to ideas in general, but also the way they think about the world is not dramatically different like it could be in some religions. And there's not places where you just have to say, sorry. Well, there are some, but usually when you're saying that, they're willing to change their beliefs in a way that maybe a Jewish or Christian Islamic person, Muslim person wouldn't. Although I'm just obviously generalizing to make a point.
Yes. Yes, I see. And so, so continuing to synthesize that, of course, in a book, interesting book, The Enlightened Gene, Biology, Buddhism, and the Convergence That Explains the World. Could you maybe describe the book and what motivated you to write it?
So earlier I mentioned talking to my friend Kunchok about karma and epigenetics. So he was here, he was in our first course, and then he was part of the first group that was here at Emory taking science courses. And we became good buddies, and one day it might have been that same day, we were like, we should write a book about this, because this is unusual, this is a weird thing, you know, this Jewish guy from the South, United States, and this guy grew up herding yaks on the Tibetan plateau. We're meeting in a coffee shop and becoming friends and working on this project for monks in India. Now, this is a little bit interesting. Maybe somebody else wants to hear about that. So we started thinking about a book, what it might look like, and it wound up kind of integrating our life stories, our own personal life stories, with how the Emory-Tibet project, you know, what we brought to those and how our lives were changed by that project. And like any publication, it was enormously painful.
Yes.
It went through many, you know, had several reincarnations, so to speak, and eventually, you know, we were able to publish it. But it gets at a lot of the stuff we've been talking about. I did, the way it was difficult for Kunchok having not English as a first language. So I would kind of interview him, so to speak, and then translate his English into what I thought he had said, and then I would show it to him, and we'd go back and forth, and then we'd take if you read the book, you'll see the stories, his stories are integrated word for word after our back and forth in the text that I write, since, you know, I'm the English speaker and we're writing a book in English. So it was fun. I don't know if I recommend it or anything. It was translated into Korean, so there's a Korean version of it, which is cool. I assume it's been translated into Tibetan, but speaking of which, there's just that's only one of, you know, a growing dozens and dozens of ripple effects of this project that nobody could have predicted. Not just academic things, but people's lives changing and people becoming Buddhists. Excuse me. And people becoming scientists who are Buddhists, and everything in between. There's been all kinds of changes in the way people teach when they come back to the United States, and the way Buddhists think about, you know, their lives, and just on and on. There's a new project up at Northwestern where half a dozen monks and lay Tibetans are doing neuroscience research themselves. They're not being researched on, they're doing research themselves up in Northwestern with Robin Newslock, a psychologist, and, you know, on and on. The number of spin-offs or ripple effects of this project, as I guess you would predict when hundreds of people get together. And thousands of monks have now gone through the curriculum, so even if only 10% of them got anything out of it, there's a continuing ripple effect.
And it's a non-linear effect as well.
Of course.
Just going through that. And of course, during, as we were discussing before, during the exile of the Tibetans from China, during that cultural revolution to India, I imagine as well the Tibetan Buddhist movement has also expanded outside of Asia as well. Are there also efforts to maybe take the teaching to other Tibetan institutions?
Yeah, so interesting you mentioned that. We have evidence that our translations of science texts into Tibetan have leaked back into Tibet. They just strip off any mention of the Dalai Lama.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of cool, because there's a lot of very isolated, uneducated, in Western sense, communities there. More importantly, folks that just don't have any knowledge of modern healthcare or anything like that. So that's exciting. I mentioned the translation in Korean. There's a sizable community, 10,000 or so Tibetans in New York City. So there's, outside of India and Tibet, there's, you know, it's kind of spreading there. And then I talked in Taiwan to Buddhist communities, and Japan, and I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, I believe that answers the question, and with the goal that you could potentially consider introducing the materials. I mean, I imagine
Oh,
the Japanese and Korean Buddhism does this fall more within the Mahayana vehicle, which is closer to Tibetan Buddhism?
yeah. I think in those cases, it was more just of a cultural sharing, cultural interest. I don't know. Actually, the people in Taiwan have a full Buddhist community where they're trying to integrate Buddhism into all the things they're teaching. So they were interested in, like, at the college and post-college level, how to bring in our experiences and bringing science and bringing Buddhism into science, because they want to teach the science. So it varied on the community that I was talking to. But I talked to a lot of people who just are educators, because so much about, in terms of this project, because so much that we learned from this project, I don't know why, but when you go to a place that's so different and do what you've always done, whatever it is, practice law, teach, do medicine, you learn so many things about that field, because you're just in such a different place and you're getting such different questions that challenge your assumptions. So in doing that, like I said, people change the way they teach when they come back here. That's because a lot of their fundamental ideas about how to teach changed based on their experiences at every level: content, approach, pedagogy,
Assumptions.
My friend Dieter Jaeger here, who's like hardcore reductionist neuroscientist, used to talk about his work in computational neuroscience terms, very hardcore. He went to teach several times in India, teach the monks. Now he talks about his work in terms of free will. Just a different, same work, different place that he's looking at it from. So those kind of things are unquantifiable.
Yes. And so we've sort of touched upon how the monastics, monks and nuns were influenced by the course, but I'm intrigued how you were influenced, and particularly in questions like in your book, one of your chapters, Are Bacteria Sentient? How some of the tenets of Buddhism shaped your own outlook on the staircase of life.
Yeah, I mean, again, both in content and approach, I guess the analogy to the free will thing for me for teaching would be just this one monk that said to me what turned out to be the fundamental approach to Nalanda, which I didn't know at the time, which was when I asked him, why he was studying science instead of doing monk stuff. He said he's studying modern science to become a better Buddhist, which, from our world is just a weird thing to say.
Yes.
But, in the long run, it made me realize, it was kind of an epiphany for me, because I think, just speaking from my own field and culture, I don't know if, I'm not accusing anybody of anything, but I think your typical science teacher in colleges in the United States is probably more or less saying, I know, to the students, I know and you don't, and I'm going to pour it into you, and then you'll know, and then you'll be like me.
Yes.
Now, I'm not saying that I taught that way exactly, and of course I didn't, but, Lapsang Dondu, the guy who said that, and that approach to thinking in general really made me think differently about the teaching that I was already doing, in terms of not trying to make the students like me, but to make them better versions of who they were already.
Yes.
So, again, doing the same thing, but looking at it in a very different perspective. In terms of material, I think it often comes up. I don't even think about it anymore, but often I'll say in class, but of course, if you're a Buddhist, it could be something as simple as doing experiments on mice instead of humans, and then talking about the ethics of that, because of course, a Buddhist, like when we were working with the monks and nuns, we couldn't use any sentient beings, and we had some really funny conversations about whether plants are living or sentient or both. Or like if we wanted to look at insects, they would look at insects in the microscope, but only if somebody else had killed them or if they were found dead or something like that. a lot of what we talk about in the book, for example, a lot of modern science is very Buddhist. There's a gentleman here called Lance Gunderson who's a professor, I think he's emeritus now, in environmental sciences. And I talked to him about this very popular, his idea he had in ecology about resilience and how ecosystems are resilient and how that works. And it's a very Buddhist idea, essentially. And he was like, oh, yes. I guess I hadn't thought about that. But many people had contacted him from, resilience is like a whole field of study it's become. Yes. And his book has really contributed to that, but it started in the sciences, and it's very Buddhist. And there's been a lot of other places where that's come in. I mean, Buddhism's been around a long time, and there's a lot of leakage across culture and ideas, so it's not like shocking that we share ideas, right? Yes. But most scientists would say, oh, we have nothing to do with religion. It's all experimentally proven, but of course it's all driven by culture and society. Yes. And who funds what and who believes what. It's just that we often pretend that it's not. So yeah, a lot of impacts in both directions on me, my colleagues. What would be another example? I think, so I mentioned to you that their main way of learning is memorizing and then debating. They have this very choreographed debating. So every night, thousands of monks go out in the courtyards one-on-one. And the way they review the material they learn that day is by arguing with each other about it. Yes. And they have a whole physical choreography. It's also exercise, like physical exercise, mental exercise. So combining those two, I find really important. Mm-hmm. Often we just have our students sit there, right? Yes. And have the stuff poured into them. Rather, any kind of movement, correlation, connection, this kind of verbal, social review of material and getting other perspectives. So trying to incorporate those kind of learning experiences, which, Western science has also told us is useful, even though we don't do it that often. But seeing how the monks do that there is, of course, a very rich value to memorization. Mm-hmm. It can be really useful. Mm-hmm. On its own, it's fairly useless. Yes. But in conglomeration with, or in cooperation with whatever these debates, or in our culture, writing, and other things, it can be really powerful. So.
Yes. And it takes me back to thinking of our own sort of Western history of teaching, and that's as universities have effectively evolved to firstly preserve existing Christian texts, the theological texts, and even going back to the classical texts. Much of it was founded on that principle of memorization and sort of direct pedagogical teaching, in which you effectively have a lecturer, and even the root of lecturer as someone who reads to students. They pick up the information passively. Maybe it sort of continues to influence how we teach to this current day.
Oh yeah, no doubt. And while you're talking, you remind me of course, the Oxford-Cambridge model, which, if I'm not wrong, involves the lecture, but also the tutor, the one-on-one complement. We're often missing that part here. It's just the lecturing because of logistical or who knows why. But I think that is probably a good combination. Maybe we could emulate also. But just sitting there and being lectured to, especially in the days of YouTube and PowerPoint slides, seems especially, we could do a lot better.
Yes. I guess returning to the Dalai Lama as a figure, so you mentioned that he met with Bohm. I imagine he would have been quite young when he met with Bohm, therefore.
I don't know when those, probably those books were from the 70s, I guess. And so 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago.
So you mentioned that the Dalai Lama himself was very, very interested in scientific. Obviously, it was his initiative in many ways to drive it. What was the Dalai Lama like as an individual? I know that's one of your articles. You mentioned that he has a keen interest in fixing mechanical objects in astronomy.
He's hilarious. I think probably one of the best things about being a faculty at Emory is that I shared that with Jimmy Carter and the Dalai Lama, who are very similar in my mind. Mm-hmm. Not only are they both like in their 90s now, but They're hilarious people. They're super, super smart. They never lose their sense of humor. They're really short, physically short, but you never know because they're such big people, personality-wise. They're very empathic. They never take anything too seriously. Or rather, I should say that they always bring humor to the situation. They're very humble. Yeah, I find them both they both won the Nobel Prize in Peace. Maybe that's not a coincidence. The Dalai Lama particularly he practices it, so I don't know if he's the only one that could do this or something, but he practices being empathic. And a lot of the Buddhism and science overlaps with these ideas that in the West were traditionally held, at least since the Industrial Revolution, were kind of held as non-scientific, like love and empathy and compassion. All these kind of things were held as non-scientific, even though Darwin has a whole book about them. The evidence is now they're just like any other trait. You can practice them and get better at them. Some people get more better, so to speak, etc. So maybe it's not magic, and he probably meditates hours and hours a day on these different practices. But I've never seen somebody who's like so empathic, in the sense of, if that means like picking up on what other people are feeling.
Yes.
So that's kind of cool, just to be around that. I mean, and just to be around somebody who, has just had this moment in history where before, like just during my lifetime, nobody heard of him. And he was just like, even though he was looked at as a god, literally as a god by his own people, and then he was forced out of his country, and now it's hard to find somebody that hasn't heard of him.
Yes.
Just to be around somebody like that, hasn't heard of him, mostly for a good reason. Even the Chinese people themselves, many of them venerate him.
Yes.
It's more the government that's scared, essentially, of him. One of the coolest ripple effects of ETSI has been Chinese students and getting together with the monks and the nuns here on campus, because all they hear is each other's propaganda. And as usual, when human beings get together and as humans, cool things happen, and they realize they're all just, of course they can't share, they don't want anybody to take any photographs, the Chinese, because they're afraid of what their fallout back home might be. But I think that's kind of like comes from the Dalai Lama.
Yes. Fantastic, and unfortunately we have run out of time. I keep talking with you for hours, but thank you so much for joining us on In Memoriam.
I've enjoyed it. It's an honor to be your first guest.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Very good. Well, thanks, guys.